The foundation of nearly all subsequent Western philosophy rests upon the shoulders of one man, Socrates. His life, teachings, and defiant death created a blueprint for ethical inquiry and rational thought, even though he left no written document of his own. The lifespan and the Golden Age context. Socrates was born in approximately 470 BC in Athens, Greece, and lived through one of the most intellectually vibrant periods in human history, the city's Golden Age, under the leadership of Pericles. This context is critical. The philosophical questions he raised were aimed not at a decaying society, but at a culture at its arrogant zenith. He challenged Athens' perception of its own supreme wisdom and democratic perfection precisely when it felt most secure and powerful. This sense of cultural self-satisfaction provided the perfect, rich target for his relentless, critical genius. His existence was defined by a tension between his internal mission and the external world's complacency. A humble lineage and socio-economic status. Unlike many prominent figures who populated the philosophical and political landscape of Athens, Socrates came from remarkably humble and practical origins. His father, Sophroniskos, was recorded as a stonemason or a sculptor, a craftsman who worked with the physical, tangible world. His mother, Phanerete, held the profession of a midwife. This grounding in the practical, non-elite segments of Athenian society gave Socrates a unique detachment from the political and financial corruption that often tainted the intellectual class. His lack of personal financial interest, a point he would later argue at his trial, was a key facet of his moral authority. The sculptor's trade and the philosophical pivot. It is historically consistent that Socrates initially pursued his father's profession, working for a time as a stonemason and sculptor. Some accounts, often referenced by later Platonists, even credit him with having sculpted certain works, such as the figures of the Graces near the Acropolis. This initial, intense engagement with physical, measurable creation, the act of shaping inert stone into a beautiful form, provides a striking philosophical contrast to his later life. His true pivot was from crafting objects to dedicating himself entirely to the immaterial shaping of the human soul through dialectic. This personal transition symbolized the larger philosophical shift he enacted, moving the core focus of inquiry from the nature of matter to the nature of morality. The notorious physical appearance. Socrates was notoriously unhandsome, a fact that his followers, like Plato, never failed to document. He was described as possessing features considered unattractive by Athenian aesthetic standards: a flat, broad nose, bulging eyes, thick lips, and a noticeable pot-belly. He was frequently compared to the grotesque, wise, and highly eccentric mythological figure of the satyr, or to the torpedo ray, a fish that electrocutes and stuns those who touch it. A study in aesthetic contrast. This coarse physical reality stood in profound contrast to the handsome, idealized, and physically perfect standards upheld by the Athenian elite, who valued form and symmetry. This aesthetic dissonance made his intellectual and moral superiority all the more impactful, serving as a living philosophical argument. True value, wisdom, and leadership resided not in the superficial, visible body, but in the unseen, cultivated intellectual and ethical character, the very soul. It was a constant, unspoken challenge to the city's preoccupation with physical appearance. The absolute refusal to write and the Socratic problem. The most consequential decision regarding Socrates' philosophical output was his firm, lifelong refusal to commit his philosophy to writing. He fundamentally distrusted the fixed nature of the written word. He believed that genuine knowledge and true wisdom could only be transmitted and tested and ultimately internalized through live, spontaneous, demanding dialogue, the continuous, adaptive give and take of the human voice in direct, immediate contact. The limitation of text and the Socratic challenge. Socrates is recorded as believing that a written text was inert and passive, unable to defend itself when challenged, to answer follow-up questions, or to adapt its complexity to the specific needs and level of understanding of the individual reader. This commitment to the oral tradition is why everything we know about him must be filtered through the secondary accounts of others, establishing the enduring scholarly challenge known as the Socratic problem, the difficulty of isolating the historical man from his literary portrayals. The three primary, conflicting sources. Our primary, yet often contradictory, understanding of Socrates is derived almost entirely from three central figures. Plato, his most intellectually gifted student, who made Socrates the towering hero of his philosophical dramas. Xenophon, a student who was a military man and historian, providing a more prosaic, pragmatic view, and the comedic playwright Aristophanes, whose satirical attacks became part of the public narrative. The Plato problem and literary fidelity. Plato's extensive dialogues form the most complete, though often elevated, portrait of Socrates, presenting him as a figure of philosophical and rational perfection. The critical task for modern analysis is discerning the line where the historical philosopher's teachings end and where Plato's own transcendental theories, such as the theory of forms, begin to be dramatically articulated through the character he created. The earliest dialogues of Plato are generally considered the most accurate representation of the historical Socrates and his core methods. The comedic satire of Aristophanes. The playwright Aristophanes, in his celebrated but deeply damaging play, The Clouds, provided a starkly negative and inaccurate public portrayal. He unjustly satirized Socrates, incorrectly depicting him as a ridiculous sophist, a self-interested scientist who charged high fees for teaching skeptical and morally relativistic rhetoric. This popular but erroneous depiction became deeply embedded in the public consciousness, contributing significantly to the widespread suspicion and hostility from the common Athenian citizen that later fueled the political charges against him. The grounding account of Xenophon. The writings of Xenophon offer a vital counterbalance to Plato's lofty idealism and Aristophanes' caricature. Xenophon's portrait focuses on Socrates' moral stability, his common-sense approach to daily ethics, and his consistent role as a shrewd, principled counselor in managing everyday affairs. This account helps to ground the often ethereal Platonic figure, confirming Socrates' reality as a dedicated, active citizen, not merely a detached theorist. Socrates' immense influence was not accidental. It was the result of a deliberate, divinely mandated mission to interrogate the core of Athenian wisdom. This mission, sprung from a seemingly impossible declaration, would define his life and lead directly to the development of his revolutionary method. The immense philosophical significance of the oracle's prophecy requires a deep dive into the ensuing, continuous interrogation that fundamentally altered the course of Western thought. The unrelenting search for true wisdom spurred by divine irony, defined his method and antagonized the city's power structures. The philosophical journey of Socrates was set in motion by a single, paradoxical declaration that challenged his very sense of self. His subsequent reaction to this challenge forged the Socratic method, a dynamic process of inquiry that revolutionized philosophical focus and became the engine of his life's work. The Delphic oracle prophecy, the catalyst, the pivotal event that irrevocably defined Socrates' philosophical life, was the prophecy delivered by the Oracle of Delphi. His friend Chaerephon visited the oracle and asked the defining question, if anyone in Athens was wiser than Socrates. The oracle's unwavering reply was, "No man is wiser." This was not an accolade Socrates sought. It was a divine command that compelled his action. The initial disbelief and philosophical vow. Socrates was immediately perplexed and deeply skeptical of the oracle's statement, as he genuinely believed he possessed no knowledge of consequence. Instead of accepting the honor, this profound disbelief became the fuel for his lifelong philosophical mission. He vowed to test, and if possible, disprove the oracle by finding a single Athenian citizen who was wiser than himself. The systematic interrogation of the elite. Determined to carry out his mission, Socrates began a systematic, public interrogation of Athenian life. He specifically targeted the three classes most reputed for possessing superior knowledge and wisdom: politicians, who claimed to know governance; poets, who claimed divine inspiration and universal truth; and skilled craftsmen, who claimed knowledge of objective principles. The Socratic method, the elenchus. The primary technique he developed during this quest is the Socratic method, or getextit si elenchus, meaning refutation or cross-examination. It is a structured, cooperative dialogue based on asking and answering questions to stimulate critical thought and illuminate the internal contradictions within a person's most cherished beliefs. The process of refutation. The method operates by beginning with a foundational question seeking a universal definition. G, what is courage? Socrates would receive an initial premise, and then, through a rigorous sequence of subsequent, precise questions, he would demonstrate the internal inconsistency or unsoundness of that original definition, forcing the interlocutor toward a state of necessary confusion. The discovery of pseudo-knowledge. His persistent interrogation consistently revealed that the presumed experts, the politicians, the poets, and the rhetoricians, though possessing skills in their specific crafts, could not adequately define the essential, universal principles that supposedly underpinned their own actions, such as justice, piety, or goodness. Their knowledge was specialized, but not profound. The vexation of the interrogated, this repeated, systematic, and highly public exposure of the experts' intellectual arrogance and the superficiality of their knowledge created intense resentment and powerful enemies among the Athenian elite. These individuals were humiliated when Socrates showed that they truly knew nothing of genuine importance, despite their high civic standing. The revelation of the oracle's true meaning. Socrates finally concluded that the oracle was correct, but for a reason that was entirely paradoxical. He was the wisest man alive, because he was the only one in Athens who genuinely knew that he knew nothing of consequence, the only one who truly grasped the limits of human wisdom, the central principle of ignorance. The most famous Socratic statement encapsulating this conclusion is, I know that I know nothing. This statement is not a declaration of generalized ignorance, but a profound realization that human wisdom is inherently limited and flawed when measured against the standard of absolute divine truth. The virtue of self-awareness. This awareness of one's own limitations and ignorance is the essential starting point of all genuine philosophical wisdom and the necessary prelude to honest ethical inquiry. It is the recognition that true knowledge must be built from the ground up, not assumed from inherited beliefs. The shift to ethical inquiry. Socrates initiated the most significant philosophical pivot in Western history. He turned the focus of philosophy away from cosmological speculation, e.g., what is the universe made of, and decisively toward ethical and moral questions, e.g., how should we live, what is the good life? Seeking universals. The ultimate goal of the Socratic method was to arrive at universal, timeless, and unchanging definitions for ethical concepts. He believed that if a concept like justice could be universally defined, then human action could be rationally perfected. The priority of the soul, the psyche. Socrates was the first Western philosopher to rigorously prioritize the care of the soul, to textit psyche, over the care of the body, material possessions, or reputation. He defined the soul as the seat of intelligence, moral character, and true identity. The care of the self. His primary philosophical injunction, borrowed from the inscription at Delphi, was to know thyself, which meant dedicating one's life to the care of the soul, the continuous, demanding pursuit of wisdom and moral excellence. The unexamined life. This led directly to his most famous, enduring declaration: the unexamined life is not worth living. He argued that a life lived without continuous ethical and intellectual scrutiny is a life that is wasted, regardless of its material success. The unity of virtue and knowledge. Socrates famously posited the principle of intellectualism. Virtue is knowledge. He firmly believed that knowledge of the good was sufficient to compel virtuous action, making moral choice an intellectual matter rather than a matter of will. No one does wrong willingly. Following from the unity of knowledge and virtue, Socrates argued that no one does wrong willingly. Wrongdoing is a result of ignorance, a mistaken intellectual error where a person wrongly believes a harmful course of action is in some way beneficial or good for them. The problem of acrasia. This Socratic doctrine has historically struggled to account for the psychological phenomenon of natextetic acrasia, weakness of will, which is the common human experience of knowing what is good but intentionally choosing the bad path anyway. Socrates' intellectualism, by linking action solely to knowledge, effectively denied the existence of this weakness. The happiness of virtue, eudaimonia. Socrates taught that virtue is sufficient for happiness, textit is eudaimonia. A virtuous person, possessing a strong and just soul, cannot be truly harmed by external misfortune because their most valuable asset remains intact and pure. The philosophical interruption. By moving the center of intellectual activity from formal private schools and lectures to the agora, marketplace, and public streets, Socrates intentionally interrupted the typical passive flow of Athenian life, ensuring that philosophical inquiry became a public, accessible duty. Socrates as moral compass. His unwavering commitment to his inner moral and intellectual principles, even when facing the ultimate threat of death, established him as the ultimate historical model for the concept of the philosophical martyr, a person who chose principle over self-preservation. The paradoxes that Socrates introduced, that ignorance is the beginning of wisdom, and that virtue is merely a form of knowledge, provided the profound ethical architecture for his life. Yet his relentless public confrontation of Athens's moral complacency ultimately ensured that his philosophical mission would be perceived as a political threat. The trial, the unjust sentence, and the ultimate act of philosophical defiance. The intellectual turbulence created by the Socratic method, the systematic public shaming of Athens's supposed wise men, eventually coalesced into political action. The resentment found fertile ground in a city fractured by war, leading to the infamous trial that cemented Socrates' legacy not merely as a thinker, but as a moral martyr. The Peloponnesian War context. The political and military backdrop to his trial was Athens' devastating, traumatic defeat in the Peloponnesian War against Sparta, which concluded in 404 BC. The city was psychologically and financially shattered, suffering from deep instability, political paranoia, and a desperate search for internal scapegoats. Socrates' unsettling philosophy was seen as contributing to the general disorder, association with the 30 tyrants. Socrates' reputation was gravely damaged by his association with several men who later became part of the 30 tyrants, a brief but brutal oligarchic regime installed by the Spartans after the war. The most damaging associations were with his former students, the ruthless oligarchs Critias and Charmides. This association tainted his image with anti-democratic sentiment. The political motivation. Although the official charges were religious and moral, the unspoken true grievance against Socrates was fundamentally political. He was seen by the restored democratic regime as a critic of democracy, a corrosive intellectual influence, and a figure whose philosophical critique had encouraged disrespect for established authority. The accusers and their roles. In 399 BC, Socrates was formally indicted by 3 specific citizens, each representing a segment of Athenian life he had often criticized. Meletus, the poet representing the cultural elite. Anytus, a powerful, politically active tradesman representing the democratic establishment, and Lycon, the rhetorician representing the profession Socrates despised. The formal charges, twofold. The official charges leveled against him were carefully formulated into 2 distinct categories. First, corrupting the youth of Athens by encouraging them to question and disobey their parents and the established social order, and second, impiety, failing to recognize the gods of the state and introducing new divinities, a direct reference to his private spin id extit daimonion. Plato's Etextit, Apology. The most famous and detailed historical account of the trial, the primary source for understanding Socrates' defense, is Plato's dialogue, the Natextitsus Apology. The title does not mean an expression of regret, but a defense or justification of one's actions, life, and principles. Socrates' refusal to plead. During his defense, Socrates famously refused to adopt the customary strategy of the Athenian court, which involved emotional appeals, tearful pleas, or bringing his family before the jury for sympathy. He instead defended his life and principles with pure intellectual rigor and unflinching defiance, arguing based on principle, not pity. The defense as divine mandate. In his powerful defense, he justified his relentless philosophical mission not as a personal hobby or a mere nuisance, but as a divine command, a lifelong service to the god Apollo. He claimed he was the greatest gift the god had given to Athens, sent specifically to improve their souls. The first vote, guilty. The large jury, composed of 501 male Athenian citizens, ultimately voted guilty on the charges. The margin was surprisingly narrow, suggesting a significant portion of the jury was uneasy with the conviction. The penalty phase and the irony. Athenian law required both the convicted and the accusers to propose a penalty. The accusers demanded death. In a breathtaking display of Socratic irony that deeply offended the jury, Socrates initially counter-proposed that he should be rewarded with free meals for life at the public expense in the Prytaneum, an honor usually reserved for the city's greatest heroes and Olympic champions. The final counter-proposal. When forced to propose a serious, practical alternative to the death penalty, his friends urged him to suggest a substantial fine. Instead, Socrates, valuing his dignity and philosophical consistency over comfort, proposed only a modest fine of 1 mina, later raised by his friends to 30 minae. The final vote, death. Offended by his lack of remorse, his apparent disrespect for the court, and his perceived arrogance, the jury voted again and condemned him to death by a significantly wider margin than the initial guilty verdict, sealing his fate. Prophetic last words. Socrates concluded his trial not with anger, but with a composed prophecy. He warned his accusers that his execution would ultimately harm them more than him, as they would be forever judged by history for committing a profound injustice against a righteous man. The delay of execution. Following his conviction, Socrates was held in prison. Because of a sacred annual mission, the ship sent to Delos, all executions in Athens were temporarily suspended. This delay meant Socrates had spent an agonizing month in prison awaiting his fate, which he filled with philosophical debate. The Hintextet, Credo, such dialogue, and the escape plot. During this delay, Plato documents the dialogue Textet Sentia Credo, where Socrates' wealthy friend, Credo, attempts to convince him to escape from prison. Credo argued that he had arranged all the necessary bribes and escape routes for a smooth departure into exile, the philosophical refusal to escape. Socrates refused the offer, arguing that he had lived under the laws of Athens for 70 years and implicitly agreed to obey them. To escape now would be to commit a second injustice, violating the law and corrupting the state's moral authority, simply to save his own life. The priority of justice. His refusal was rooted in his ultimate philosophical priority. He asserted that the most important thing for a man is not merely to be alive, but to live a good life, a just life, and a beautiful life. The soul must never commit injustice, even when suffering it at the hands of others. The final act of execution. The method of execution was by drinking a measured dose of hemlock, a highly potent, plant-derived poison. This was considered a relatively swift and dignified death for Athenian citizens. The calm demeanor. Accounts describe Socrates maintaining an extraordinary calmness and philosophical composure in his final moments, continuing to discuss the immortality of the soul with his weeping students until the poison paralyzed him completely. The last words and the ode debt. His final recorded words were directed to Credo. Credo, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Please pay it and don't forget. Asclepius was the god of medicine. This phrase is widely interpreted as Socrates viewing death as a cure or a final release from the illness of life. The legacy of the martyr. His deliberate choice of principle over self-preservation solidified his image as the ultimate philosophical martyr, the man whose life proved his ideas and whose death gave them permanent moral authority over the centuries. The unfair condemnation and execution of Socrates did not silence his philosophy. Rather, it provided the ultimate tragic validation of his ethical doctrines, ensuring that his life's end was as necessary and truthful as its content. The enduring method and the birth of Plato's vision. The tragic and unjust end of Socrates did not terminate his philosophy. Instead, it provided the ultimate tragic validation of his ethical doctrines. His execution was the catalyst that fundamentally altered the lives of his students, most notably Plato, and launched a philosophical project that would reshape Western intellectual history forever. The post-execution shock and Plato's response. Plato was present at the trial and was so deeply and catastrophically affected by the judicial murder of his revered master that he immediately abandoned his political ambitions to become a statesman. He devoted his life entirely to philosophy, motivated primarily by the desire to secure a moral and intellectual foundation for society, to ensure that such an institutional injustice against truth could never be repeated. The founding of the Academy. As a direct and permanent intellectual response to the death of his master, who had refused to write, Plato founded the Academy in Athens around 387 BC. Named after the local hero Academus, this institution is universally recognized as the first formal institution of higher learning in the entire Western world, dedicated to rigorous philosophical and scientific inquiry. The theory of forms, Plato's development. While Socrates' teaching was based on the search for universal definitions, what is justice? The expansive philosophical system known as the theory of forms, the idea that perfect, eternal, non-physical ideals exist in a separate realm, is considered the primary innovation of Plato. It was Plato's attempt to place Socrates' ethical universals on a metaphysical foundation, guaranteeing their objective, unchanging reality. Socratic irony as a pedagogical tool. Socrates masterfully and frequently employed irony in his dialogues, often pretending to be ignorant, the famous Socratic irony, while simultaneously leading the interlocutor to expose their own profound lack of knowledge. This technique was not meant to mock, but to create intellectual humility, the necessary precondition for receiving true wisdom. The fragmentation of Socratic schools. Though Socrates offered a unified approach to ethics, his influence fragmented into various philosophical movements established by his students, demonstrating the sheer vitality and diverse interpretations of his original method. These included the Cynics, the Cyrenaics, and the intellectual powerhouse of Plato's Academy, Antisthenes, and the rise of Cynicism. Antisthenes, one of Socrates' followers, founded the Cynic school. This school took Socrates' practical emphasis on virtue, self-sufficiency, autextit autarkia, and indifference to comfort to an extreme. They advocated for a simple, ascetic life lived in radical accordance with nature, a philosophy later famously exemplified by Diogenes of Sinope, Aristippus, and the Cyrenaic school. Conversely, Aristippus, another student, founded the Cyrenaic school. This group twisted Socrates' connection between goodness and pleasure, asserting that immediate sensual gratification and bodily pleasure were the highest achievable good. This school is considered a direct precursor to later philosophical hedonism. The great chain of philosophical influence. The profound philosophical lineage he established runs directly and consequentially. Socrates trained Plato, who trained Aristotle, who in turn tutored Alexander the Great. This intellectual chain established the dominant philosophical and scientific framework that shaped the entire Hellenistic world and subsequently all of Western and Middle Eastern thought. The influence on logic and definitions. Socrates' rigorous method of definition, classification, and cross-examination, the non textet elenchus, heavily influenced the foundational development of formal logic as it was later systematically articulated and organized by his philosophical grandson, Aristotle, the designation as father of ethics. Socrates is universally regarded as the father of Western ethics, as he was the first major philosopher to dedicate his entire life to systematically investigating and attempting to define moral concepts, justice, piety, virtue, independently of mythological, religious, or cosmological explanations. The enduring maxims. His maxim that the unexamined life is not worth living remains the fundamental injunction of philosophical self-reflection, moral scrutiny, and personal accountability in contemporary thought, urging every individual to consciously evaluate their core beliefs. Socrates in Christian thought. Later thinkers, particularly early Christian writers, often regarded Socrates with great favor, viewing him as a pre-Christian martyr. They saw a parallel in his persecution, arguing that he, guided by his divine inner voice, had been seeking a truth similar to monotheism and was unjustly killed by a pagan state. A model of rational dissent. Socrates serves as the enduring, powerful model for rational dissent and the defense of individual, informed conscience against the potentially arbitrary and tyrannical demands of the majority or the state apparatus. The Socratic dialogue genre. Plato's literary creation, the Socratic dialogue, established an entirely new, dynamic genre of philosophical writing. It prioritized inquiry, debate, and the unfolding drama of logical argument over the static, dogmatic presentation of ideas found in treatises. Socrates' humor and wit. Accounts from both Xenophon and Plato often suggest that despite his serious moral purpose and intense focus, Socrates possessed a distinctive wit and humor which he frequently employed in his ironic exchanges and playful mockery of his overconfident students and interlocutors. The Socratic problem revisited. Modern scholarship continues the intense, necessary work of addressing the Socratic problem, meticulously analyzing the linguistic, thematic, and developmental distinctions across Plato's dialogues in an attempt to isolate the historical man's actual teachings from his students' towering literary and philosophical additions. The priority of self-sufficiency. He fiercely championed self-sufficiency, textit ichus autarkia, arguing that a life governed by reason and virtue makes one independent of external circumstances, material possessions, and the vagaries of fortune, thereby protecting the soul from corruption and external harm. The legacy of the method, not the system. Socrates' most powerful and enduring contribution is that he offered no finished closed system of dogma or definitive answers, but only a method, the non textet elenchus, in an ethical challenge. This forces every subsequent generation and student to engage in the difficult, necessary work of self-discovery and defining the good life for themselves. The facts surrounding his life, his teachings, and his defiant death are not merely historical footnotes. They form the bedrock upon which our modern understanding of morality, logic, and self-knowledge has been constructed. His legacy is one of unwavering interrogation, urging us always to look deeper than the surface. The Socratic paradoxes. The ethics of knowledge and injustice. The true revolutionary nature of Socratic thought lies in a series of bold, counterintuitive ethical claims, often called the Socratic paradoxes. These are the central tenets that distinguish his moral philosophy, asserting a fundamental link between knowledge, virtue, and personal happiness that seems to contradict common human experience. The knowledge-virtue equation. At the heart of his ethics lies the intellectualist position, the claim that virtue is knowledge. Socrates fundamentally believed that excellence of character, dextet e arete, was not a matter of divine grace, emotional disposition, or habit, but purely a matter of intellectual insight. To truly know the good is, by necessity, to do the good. This reduces moral failure not to a weakness of the will, but to a failure of intellect. The paradox of involuntary evil. Following from the knowledge-virtue link, Socrates asserted the paradoxical doctrine that no one does evil willingly. This implies that when a person commits an act of harm or injustice, they are doing so under the mistaken belief that their action is, in some twisted way, ultimately beneficial or good for them. Therefore, all wrongdoing is considered an intellectual error, an instance of profound ignorance, the denial of akrasia, weakness of will. This philosophy fundamentally requires Socrates to reject the concept of nullum textet, akrasia, or weakness of will, the common human experience of knowing what is right, e.g., to eat healthily, but choosing to do the opposite anyway, also eat unhealthily. Since Socrates believed that knowledge compels action, he argued that what appears to be a textet akrasia is simply a manifestation of incomplete or superficial knowledge of the true good, the priority of the soul's integrity. Socrates was the first philosopher to establish the concept of psychological integrity as the highest good. He argued that the most catastrophic harm a person can suffer is the corruption of their own soul, textet psyche, by committing an injustice. External harms, such as poverty, illness, or even death, cannot touch the soul and are therefore secondary. The paradox of suffering, injustice. This led to his most profound ethical paradox. It is better to suffer injustice than to commit it. While suffering injustice harms the body or possessions, committing injustice corrupts the soul, which he deemed the true, most valuable part of the self. He chose death over breaking the law for this very reason, proving the doctrine with his life. Virtue is sufficient for happiness, eudaimonia. Socrates was an early proponent of the view that virtue is sufficient for happiness, textet eudaimonia. He defined genuine happiness as a state of well-being and flourishing that results solely from living a morally excellent and rational life, making a person's inner condition impervious to the whims of fortune or external circumstance. The true polis, city-state. Socrates implicitly taught that the true textet polis, city-state, was not defined by its physical walls, its population size, or its political constitution, but rather by the moral and intellectual character of its citizens. His entire mission was a civic effort to improve the quality of the Athenian zos textet polis by improving the souls of its individual citizens. Socrates as a model of self-mastery. His life served as a constant demonstration of textit enkritia, or self-mastery. His legendary indifference to cold, hunger, and physical comfort, combined with his sobriety and composure under pressure, showed his students that the rational soul could perfectly command the body and its appetites. The philosophical purpose of punishment. Unlike the common view of punishment as retribution, Socrates argued that punishment must be viewed as a form of moral medicine necessary to cure the disease of ignorance and injustice that infects the soul. This concept shifts punishment from vengeance to necessary education and correction. The role of the divine sign, daimonion, revisited. His famous internal voice, the intextit daimonion, acts as a practical confirmation of his ethical structure. By only intervening to prohibit unjust or unwise actions, it reinforced the idea that human choice, when left unhindered by divine veto, must default to the rational, virtuous course determined by knowledge, the enduring value of poverty. Socrates' deliberate choice of poverty was an active philosophical statement. The true philosopher must demonstrate through their life that they value knowledge, wisdom, and the care of the soul above all else, including material comfort, proving that the highest good is non-material. These challenging ethical doctrines, that goodness is knowledge and suffering injustice is better than committing it, were the intellectual scaffolding for his life. They provided the profound, rational basis for his final calm confrontation with death. The Socratic legacy, fragmentation, influence, and the Hellenistic schools. The execution of Socrates, while tragic, served a crucial function. It elevated his ethics to a moral absolute, transforming his life's end into the ultimate philosophical proof. The next generation of thinkers, unable to ignore his towering influence, either built upon his foundations or reacted against them, leading to the establishment of the major philosophical schools of the Hellenistic period. The fragmentation of Socratic thought. Despite the unity of his ethical mission, Socrates' philosophy was so focused on method and inquiry rather than fixed dogma that it fragmented immediately upon his death. His teachings inspired a diverse array of philosophical schools founded by his direct students, demonstrating the sheer vitality and openness of his original approach. The foundation of the Cynic school. Antisthenes, a devoted follower of Socrates, founded the Cynic school. The Cynics interpreted Socrates' emphasis on virtue, self-sufficiency, textit autarkia, and indifference to material comfort as a radical mandate for a simple, austere life. They actively rejected all social conventions, property, and civic duties in favor of living entirely in accordance with nature. Diogenes of Sinope, the archetype. The most famous exponent of the Cynic school was Diogenes of Sinope, who took Socratic indifference to an extreme. He famously lived in a large ceramic jar, mocked the pretension of Athenian society, and carried a lamp in the marketplace during the day, claiming to be looking for an honest man. He saw Socrates' simple life as the true path to freedom, the Cyrenaic school and the hedonist path. Conversely, Aristippus, another student, founded the Cyrenaic school. This group interpreted Socrates' acknowledgement of the connection between goodness and pleasure in a very narrow, simplistic way. They asserted that immediate sensual gratification and bodily pleasure were the highest achievable goods, thereby prioritizing the feelings of the moment over long-term rational planning. This school is considered a direct precursor to philosophical hedonism. The great chain of philosophical lineage. The intellectual continuity established by Socrates is immense and consequential, representing the transfer of knowledge across generations. Socrates trained Plato, who trained Aristotle, who in turn tutored the great military and cultural figure, Alexander the Great. This philosophical chain established the intellectual framework for the entire Hellenistic world. The impact on formal logic. Socrates' rigorous use of the non-textet scalenchus, the method of systematic definition and cross-examination, provided the conceptual groundwork that heavily influenced the development of formal logic as it was later meticulously systematized and articulated by his philosophical grandson, Aristotle, Socrates as the father of Western ethics. Socrates is universally recognized as the father of Western ethics, a title earned because he was the first major thinker to dedicate his entire life to systematically investigating, defining, and prioritizing moral concepts, justice, piety, virtue, independently of mythical narratives or cosmological speculation. The enduring maxims of self-reflection. His powerful declaration that the unexamined life is not worth living remains the fundamental, enduring injunction of philosophical self-reflection, moral scrutiny, and personal accountability in all subsequent Western thought, urging every individual to consciously evaluate their core beliefs and actions. Socrates in Christian and monotheistic thought. Later thinkers, particularly early Christian writers and theologians, often viewed Socrates with profound respect. They saw him as a pre-Christian martyr who, guided by his divine inner voice, had been seeking a truth similar to monotheism and was unjustly persecuted and killed by a pagan state. The model of rational descent. Socrates serves as the primary, enduring model for rational descent and the ultimate defense of individual, informed conscience against the arbitrary and sometimes tyrannical demands of the majority or the state apparatus. His refusal to escape prison is the canonical example. The Socratic dialogue is a literary genre. Plato's literary invention, the Socratic dialogue, created an entirely new and highly influential genre of philosophical writing. This style prioritized inquiry, dynamic debate, and the unfolding drama of logical argument over the static, fixed presentation of ideas found in traditional treatises. The principle of a textet ius autarchias, self-sufficiency. He strongly championed self-sufficiency, new textet civis autarchia, arguing that a life governed by reason and virtue makes one entirely independent of external circumstances, material fortune, or social dependency, which he viewed as potential sources of corruption and instability. The legacy of method, not solutions. Socrates' most vital and enduring contribution is that he offered no finished closed system of dogma or definitive final answers. Instead, he provided only a powerful method, cogit textet civis elenchus, and an ethical challenge, forcing every student and successive generation to engage in the difficult necessary work of continuous self-discovery. The fragmentation of the Socratic schools demonstrates the wide net his method cast, yet every school, whether Cynic or academic, looked back to his final, definitive act for its moral authority. His ultimate contribution was to make the pursuit of wisdom an active, ethical duty, not merely an academic pastime. The Socratic citizen. Politics, law, and the duty of dissent. Socrates was intensely concerned with the political health of Athens, but his approach was unique. He never held high public office, yet his actions and teachings deeply implicated the structure of the texted polis, Stoic city-state, influencing Athenian law, political philosophy, and the very concept of civic duty. His philosophical detachment was, paradoxically, his most potent political weapon. Socrates and democratic skepticism. While he fought for Athens as a soldier and accepted its ultimate authority, Socrates was a prominent critic of direct Athenian democracy. He particularly questioned its reliance on majority opinion and the pervasive influence of popular rhetoric, which he believed was easily manipulated by self-interested or unexamined ignorance. He argued that ruling a state requires skill and knowledge, not just popular approval. The fear of rhetoric and the sophists. He maintained a deep philosophical skepticism toward the sophists, itinerant teachers who focused on texted rhetoric nuars, the art of persuasive speaking, and often charged high fees. Socrates believed they prioritized convincing and winning arguments over the pursuit of truth, thus polluting the public discourse and undermining genuine ethical inquiry. The true purpose of his political engagement. Socrates never sought to overturn the Athenian state. Rather, his constant public questioning was an attempt to purify the democracy from within. He viewed his mission as a civic duty, a philosophical service intended to remind the citizens of their need for moral and intellectual vigilance to prevent the state from falling into ethical decay. The philosophical ideal of the ruler. Through his dialogues, Socrates articulated the concept that the ideal ruler should be a philosopher king, a leader whose decisions are based on rational, universal knowledge of the good, rather than on personal ambition or political expediency. This idea was later expanded upon by Plato, the paradox of the trial in the law. The trial of Socrates represents a profound paradox. The democratic city that prized the freedom of its citizens executed the very man who championed intellectual freedom and the most fundamental aspect of self-governance, self-examination. His execution served as a brutal, historical example of democratic failure. Socrates' respect for law, nomos. His famous refusal to escape prison, documented in the Texted Credo, demonstrated his absolute, non-negotiable respect for the laws, texted nomos of the state, even when those laws were unjustly applied against him. He argued that a citizen who has accepted the benefits of living under a state's laws implicitly agrees to accept its ultimate judgments. The enduring influence on law, just Socratic method. Though executed by the legal system, Socrates' methodology became a permanent part of that system's education. The technique of sustained, intense cross-examination to expose faulty assumptions is still known as the Socratic method and remains a key pedagogical tool in modern law schools and legal debate. The concept of the unwritten laws. Socrates placed great emphasis on the unwritten laws, the moral imperatives and ethical duties that stand above the written codes. He believed these universal moral obligations, dictated by reason and conscience, were the source of true justice and were the laws he implicitly followed, even to his death. The priority of moral consistency. His entire life was a lesson in moral consistency. He proved that the integrity of one's actions and principles is more important than mere survival, thereby establishing the philosophical framework for the sanctity of individual conscience against state power. The final philosophical act as political statement. The manner of his death, calmly accepting the verdict, refusing to commit injustice by escaping and engaging in final philosophical discussions, was itself a profound political statement. It demonstrated that true control over one's life is internal and moral, not external and physical. Socrates and civil disobedience. While he did not explicitly advocate for civil disobedience in the modern sense, as he obeyed the final sentence, his life laid the groundwork for the concept. His willingness to provoke the state and accept the penalty rather than compromise his ethical mission established the principle that one may be required to place moral duty above legal command. The legacy of the examined citizen. Socrates' greatest civic legacy is the concept of the examined citizen, the individual whose participation in the political life of the community is informed by continuous self-scrutiny and an unwavering rational search for justice. The paradox of the executed citizen, the man who loved his city yet challenged its wisdom, ensured that his moral authority would survive the democracy that killed him. This philosophical strength, derived from the soul's detachment, must now be further examined through the lens of history, art, and subsequent thought. The Socratic legacy in art, literature, and philosophy. The philosophical gravity of Socrates' life and death was immediately recognized by the ancient world. His image, the ugly, barefoot man who was morally invincible, became a timeless subject for art, literature, and the continuous philosophical development that followed, ensuring his concepts were preserved for millennia. Socrates in ancient sculpture. His unique physical appearance, so at odds with his inner virtue, made him a captivating subject for ancient artists. Sculptors often depicted him with his characteristic satyr-like features, flat nose, wide eyes, sometimes placing him alongside figures like the handsome Alcibiades to visually represent the philosophical idea that inner goodness is superior to outward beauty. The power of Plato's literary portraits. Plato's creation of the Socratic dialogue was not merely a reporting of events. It was a deliberate literary project that endowed Socrates with dramatic and rhetorical power. By making his master the protagonist in nearly all his works, Plato ensured that Socrates would become a foundational literary figure, the archetype of the rational, unshakable truth-seeker. Socrates and Neoplatonism. Centuries after his death, during the Roman era, the school of Neoplatonism revered Socrates. They interpreted his Kenoitextus Daemonion not merely as a personal warning voice, but as a direct link to the divine intellect or the transcendent one, further cementing his image as a prophetic, semi-divine figure who possessed an extraordinary connection to absolute truth. The Stoic interpretation of virtue. The Stoics, another influential Hellenistic school, took Socrates' principle that virtue is sufficient for happiness, in textit eudaimonia, and made it the cornerstone of their philosophy. They interpreted his composure in the face of death as the ultimate proof of their ideal. The wise man is immune to external misfortune because his happiness is secured entirely by his rational, moral choices. The Socratic influence on Epictetus. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus, an ex-slave, frequently cited Socrates as the perfect example of the philosopher's duty. Epictetus focused on Socrates' distinction between things in our power, our judgments, desires, and actions, and things not in our power, everything external, highlighting Socrates' serenity as the result of exercising control only over his inner life. Socrates and Diogenes Laertius. The historian Diogenes Laertius, in his work Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers, 3rd century AD, dedicated an entire section to Socrates, solidifying his placement as the central figure from which nearly all subsequent philosophical lineage flowed, marking a watershed moment in the history of thought. The Unexamined Life and Modern Psychology. His famous maxim, "The unexamined life is not worth living," remains a cornerstone not just of philosophy, but of modern depth psychology and psychotherapy. The Socratic mandate to understand one's motivations, biases, and core beliefs is the intellectual foundation of conscious self-improvement and mental health. Socrates as a figure of Christian humanism. During the Renaissance and early modern periods, humanists embraced Socrates as a model of virtuous paganism. Thinkers like Erasmus viewed him as the most ethically pure ancient figure, demonstrating that reason and virtue could be pursued even without revelation, often repeating the phrase, "Holy Socrates, pray for us." The influence on René Descartes. The entire modern philosophical project can be traced back to a Socratic starting point. When René Descartes initiated his methodical doubt, tearing down all assumed knowledge to build philosophy anew on the certain foundation of the cogito, "I think, therefore I am," he was essentially executing the Socratic injunction to know thyself and submit all premises to rigorous rational scrutiny. Socrates, in neoclassical art. The tragic final scene of his life was immortalized in the neoclassical era, most famously in Jacques-Louis David's 1787 painting, The Death of Socrates. This painting became an iconic visual representation of rational stoicism and the triumph of principle over fear, making him a symbol for the Enlightenment and revolutionary ideals. The final philosophical ideal. Ultimately, Socrates stands as a universal philosophical ideal, the man who placed unyielding integrity of thought and moral truth above all considerations, including his own physical existence. He proved that philosophy was not an abstract theory, but a specific, demanding way of life. The enduring image of the old philosopher, serene in his final moments, has continued to challenge and inspire. His story transcends mere history, providing a permanent benchmark for courage and intellectual honesty. The modern Socratic revival and enduring relevance. The influence of Socrates did not end with the classical period. His methods and ethical imperatives have found renewed life in modern thought, education, and social criticism. His philosophy provides a perennial framework for confronting uncertainty and demanding intellectual honesty in the contemporary world. Socrates and modern existentialism. The 19th century philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, considered the father of existentialism, dedicated his master's thesis to Socratic irony. Kierkegaard deeply admired Socrates' emphasis on subjective truth and the difficulty of the individual's ethical choice, positioning the Greek philosopher as the central precursor to the entire existentialist project. The Socratic dialogue in education. Beyond the law, the Socratic method remains a core pedagogical tool in liberal arts education across the globe. By emphasizing active learning through continuous questioning rather than passive reception of facts, the method challenges students to articulate and defend their own beliefs, promoting genuine intellectual independence. The relevance to democracy and post-truth. In contemporary political philosophy, Socrates serves as a potent antidote to issues like propaganda and the post-truth era. His insistence on rigorous definition and rational consensus highlights the essential fragility of democracy when public discourse is based on unexamined opinion and emotional rhetoric, a challenge that remains acutely relevant today. Socrates and the computer age. Paradoxically, Socrates' rejection of writing has been reinterpreted in the age of information overload. His call to prioritize the integration of knowledge over the mere accumulation of data, which he felt writing encouraged, is seen as a critique of modern information consumption, urging us to question the value of easily accessible but unexamined facts. The Socratic Seminar. The Socratic Seminar is a formal, small group discussion format used in schools worldwide, directly modeled after the Textit Elenchus. Its goal is not to win an argument, but to arrive at a deeper understanding of complex texts and ideas through collaborative, reasoned inquiry, perpetuating his dedication to dialectic. Socrates in contemporary ethics. His ethical paradox, that no one does wrong willingly, forces contemporary ethical theorists to reconsider the nature of moral failure. It frames societal problems, such as crime and corruption, not as issues of inherent wickedness, but as systemic failures of education and rational knowledge, shifting the focus toward enlightenment and reform. The philosopher as public servant. Socrates' life redefined the role of the philosopher, transforming it from a detached academic pursuit into a form of public service. He demonstrated that the highest intellectual duty is not to retreat to the tower, but to engage directly with the messy, vital issues of the Textit Polis in a continuous, critical effort to elevate the common good. Socrates and social criticism. The gadfly analogy remains the enduring symbol for the role of the social critic. It justifies the necessary function of the philosopher, journalist, or artist who must irritate, provoke, and challenge the powerful structures and complacent majorities to maintain the moral health and awareness of the society. The enduring question of immortality. His final conversations, documented in Plato's Phaedo, established the Western philosophical tradition of debating the immortality of the soul in Textit Psyche. Socrates presented rational arguments for the soul's survival after death, thereby making the question of eternity a matter for philosophical speculation, not just religious faith. The final affirmation of life. Ultimately, Socrates' entire existence, the self-imposed poverty, the relentless questioning, the unwavering moral stand, serves as a complete, unconditional affirmation of the examined life. He proved that human life, when lived with integrity and rational inquiry, possesses an inherent, self-sufficient value that transcends all external threats. The universal man. His life achieved a rare status, the universal man. Socrates' teachings addressed fundamental timeless questions about justice, courage, and goodness, making his philosophy relevant to every culture and era, ensuring that his influence is permanently woven into the fabric of human thought. The final facts of Socrates' life and influence confirm that the greatest philosopher is not the one who provides all the answers, but the one who asks the questions so profoundly that they reshape the moral architecture of the world. His legacy is eternal, maintained not by monuments, but by the continuous act of self-examination. The unseen architect of Western thought, the philosophical conclusion, the eternal significance of the examined life. The philosophical significance of Socrates is not contained within a set of doctrines, but in the active imperative he left to humanity, the unwavering demand for self-knowledge and rational integrity. The final facts summarize his eternal place in history and provide the ultimate conclusion to the concept of the examined life. Socrates as the aporia architect. The Socratic method frequently resulted in a state known as textit des aporia, meaning puzzlement or intellectual impasse. This was a deliberate outcome. Socrates considered textit des aporia a necessary, painful stage where the individual realizes their ignorance, thus clearing the ground for the genuine construction of knowledge. He was the architect of necessary confusion. The Socratic method in modern psychology. Beyond therapy, the Socratic method has been adapted into cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, where practitioners use Socratic questioning to challenge and identify a patient's irrational beliefs and cognitive distortions. This confirms the enduring utility of his dialectic for mental well-being. The principle of ukun, a subtle but powerful rhetorical device used by Socrates, was the use of the word textit ukun, meaning roughly, does it not follow, therefore? This phrase was used to press the interlocutor into drawing necessary logical conclusions from their previous statements, forcing them to own the consequences of their flawed premises. The philosophical ideal of self-governance. Socrates' life embodies the philosophical ideal that true freedom lies in self-governance achieved through reason. By mastering his desires, passions, and fears, he demonstrated that a man can be sovereign over his own internal domain, even when externally imprisoned or condemned. The legacy of the ugly saint. Socrates is often referred to as the ugly saint of philosophy. This title captures the paradoxical nature of his appeal. His complete lack of physical vanity and wealth made his moral and intellectual perfection shine brighter, serving as a permanent example of the triumph of inner virtue over outward appearance. Socrates and the rule of law. His final act of accepting death rather than breaking the law established a critical philosophical precedent. The stability of the state and the rule of law are morally imperative, even when the law is applied unjustly. This paradox underscores the tension between individual conscience and civic duty. The unwritten curriculum. Socrates' teachings were not a set of prescribed answers, but an unwritten curriculum of questions. His students did not simply memorize his doctrines. They learned how to think, a legacy far more valuable and enduring than any set of fixed philosophical conclusions. Socrates and the concept of duty, kathekon. Though primarily associated with Stoicism, Socrates modeled the concept of spectation textit kathekon, appropriate action or duty. Every action he took, from serving in the military to interrogating citizens, was viewed as a necessary, rational fulfillment of his divine and civic duty. The finality of the soul's journey. Socrates treated his own death not as a tragedy, but as the final, necessary stage of the soul's philosophical journey. By calmly facing it, he completed his life's argument, proving that his belief in the soul's priority and the sufficiency of virtue was absolute and non-negotiable. The universal man of questioning. Socrates achieved the rare status of a universal man by dedicating his life to universal, timeless questions about justice, courage, and goodness. His philosophy remains relevant because he addressed the permanent architecture of human moral life, ensuring his work is a continuous, living critique of every age. The final philosophical imperative. The ultimate philosophical imperative left by Socrates is the demand for unconditional intellectual honesty. He requires every person to live a life worth repeating, a life so thoroughly examined and ethically consistent that if faced with the oracle's challenge, one could affirm their entire existence without regret. The profound significance of Socrates is that he provided humanity not with a comfortable conclusion, but with the necessary ongoing work, the perpetual duty to know thyself and to live the examined life. His story ends not with silence, but with an eternal question mark placed at the heart of Western civilization.